I recently built my first hydrofoil board. This footage you're seeing right now is the final product. It's constructed from a chambered out cedar strip core and reinforced with a single layer of 6-ounce S-glass on each side. It's definitely considered a pocket board at 32 inches long and 16 inches wide, with final weight of just under 6 pounds or about 2.7 kilograms. So it's a bit heavy, but it's not bad when you consider the extra rigidity of the core you're benefiting from. I'll be using it for dock starting and wake foiling behind a boat. I'm really happy with how the final product came out, despite making quite a few mistakes during the build. This video is going to walk through the construction process and talk about the unexpected challenges and what I do differently next time. The first step was cutting down the cedar planks to length. You can see here I've oriented the middle set of boards vertically like a floor joist, whereas on either side the boards are oriented horizontally like a deck plank. After deciding the order of where each plank was going to go based off of color and grain quality, I made sure to label so that I knew exactly where each of these planks went in the lineup. I clamped all the boards together as a dry fit just to make marking and layout easier. I ended up coming up with 4 or 5 different patterns as to how I was going to route out the hollow chambers of the board. And then after everything was clamped together, I made sure to go in and mark each of these patterns by assigning it a letter, A, B, C, or D, so that I could do all the layout at the beginning, and when it was time to drill and route, I could focus on just that. This was actually my first time ever using a router, so it took me a while to figure out exactly how I was going to brace everything to be able to do this safely. Because I had 2 different orientations of boards, the vertical and horizontal, I had to set up a couple of different jigs to make sure everything was going to go smoothly. You can see here the first set of boards that I routed out. As it was my first time ever using a router, the channels I was cutting didn't end up the cleanest, but I definitely got better as time went on. Here's one of the center boards with a lot more material removed, and you can see I started to get a much cleaner output from the router. Here you can see all the boards with their final channels cut into them. Each plank is rotated 90 degrees from how it's going to be in the final product. This is just so you can see which channels are routed all the way through the board. You'll notice I didn't do any cuts at the back of the board, and that's to allow for the most rigidity around where the mast is going to connect to the board. Here's a clip showing the middle section of vertically oriented boards, and we've got channels going all the way through to the other side. I glued up each of the 3 sections of the board using wood glue, and then sanded and hand planed it to get a nice flat surface. I used the router here again to cut out a nice slot where the mast tracks are going to go. Here I did a test fit with the mast in the tracks. They're not actually glued into the board yet, it's just a dry fit, and I made sure that it was going to slide forward and backward smoothly. The reason the middle boards were oriented vertically was to make sure there was enough clearance to actually insert the mast track fin box. Because there's so much more material towards the nose of the board that wasn't necessary, I decided to remove it. The method that ended up working pretty well was to take a saw, cut down to the depth that I wanted, which was about halfway through the board, and then use a chisel to pry and knock out the chips of cedar that I wanted to remove. This part took some time, but as you can see, it was pretty effective in getting to that depth that I wanted and removing all that excess material to shave off some weight. I gave that area a quick sand to smooth everything out. I then used an orbital sander to round off that sharp edge at the front of the mast tracks, and then used a router with a 45-degree bit alongside the mast track area. The next step was to glue up each of the 3 pieces, the middle, the left, and the right side of the board. I started out by just doing 2 at a time. Gluing on the third and last piece was a little bit tricky. I only had 2 clamps that were long enough to reach all the way across the board, so I had to get a little bit creative here with 2 sets of clamps pulling onto each other, one from the top side, one from the bottom side. This didn't result in the straightest glue up, and if I had to do this again, I think I would just orient all the boards vertically and then use the saw and chisel method to chip out all the extra material. I remarked my outline shape on the board and began to cut it out with a handsaw. At this point, I began to start doing a lot of sanding to round out the nose and all the hard edges on the board to make everything nice and smooth. I found that using a flashlight in some of the more complex curve areas of the board helped in the sanding process. I tried to get the shadows to be as even as possible on either side. After the shaping was done, I ran through several grits of sanding up to about 220 to get everything really smooth, and the board's really starting to come together at this point. Next, I epoxied in the plastic fin box inserts into the mass track slots I routed out earlier. After prepping the board and the workspace for fiberglassing, I applied a small decal here to the underside. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I used a single layer of 6-ounce S-glass and just rolled out the cloth, cut it to shape, made some relief cuts at the edges of the angles, taped off the fin boxes, and made sure to tape off my lap line on the top side of the board. And then I just wet out the fabric with epoxy resin. And as you can see here, the epoxy, when it hits the wood surface, it just brightens it up, brings it to life, and makes it look amazing. I repeated that process on the top side of the board, again with the layer of 6-ounce S-glass. I then applied a fill coat with another thin layer of epoxy, and it made the surface super glossy. You can see here though on the right side of the board where the reflection is hitting it, that fill coat is still not perfectly even, so I'll have to do some extra sanding to get it to be a perfectly flat surface. Kind of a funny story here, before I had put the fill coat on, I'd actually gotten a cut on my thumb and apparently smudged a bit of blood on the nose of the board here, and it was actually almost completely invisible until applying that fill coat, which made the board really glossy, really shiny, and just made that blood bright red. I was hoping I was going to be able to remove it with sanding. I was able to make it dull and not as obvious, but it did not get completely removed in the final product. Here's the beginning of the final sanding process. I started with 80 grit and actually went all the way up to 2000 grit and then finished off with a polish for kind of a semi-gloss finish. And here we are again with the final product. Not quite as glossy as right after the fill coat or the hot coat was applied, but it's a much nicer, flatter surface. You can see here I used a decal ruler at the mass box to be able to measure where the mass is placed. And then I ended up going with clear hex pad traction, which was really my only option because I really did not want to cover up the surface of this wood. So we'll see how grippy it is, how well it lasts, but I'm pretty happy with the overall aesthetic of the board. Final weight with all of the hex attraction applied is just under 2,700 grams, so 2.7 grams or 5 pounds, 15 ounces. And there you have it. That's the build. That's the finished product. I'm really happy with how it came out, especially with it being my first attempt. Learned a ton throughout this process, and I'm hoping to apply it to several more builds in the future.